Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's video I'm going to continue the Endgame series with the greatest endgames ever played by the greatest ever endgame player in history, Jose Raúl Capablanca. We are going to be looking at 4 of his very famous games. You may have seen them before, but nevertheless they are absolutely, well, they're textbook examples of amazing endgame technique, and you should know them. You should know them by heart. So we are going to be looking at the games in the correct order, starting with 1921, the earliest game, and this is actually one of the decisive games in Capablanca's World Championship match against Emanuel Lasker, and we will end the video with his game against Nimzowitsch, played in New York in 1927. So let's start. This is the game Lasker Capablanca. So this is round 10. Let me give you a brief intro about the World Championship match. So in January of 1920, they agreed to play a match for the title in 1921. And then in June, Lasker resigned the match without playing and declared Capablanca the world champion at the moment. Before that, Lasker was the world champion. And Capablanca said he didn't want to become the world champion that way, so he managed to convince Lasker to play, and Lasker finally agreed, but agreed to play upon the condition that he was the challenger in the match and not the world champion. So the match was played in Havana in April and March of 1921. The winner would be declared after one of the players gets 8 points. Draws were not counting. And if neither player reached 8 points, then the one with more points after 24 games would win. And okay, there was a lot of prize money, $11,000 for Capablanca, for Lasker, and 9 for Capablanca being the champion, and additional money depending on who wins how many games, etc. So a lot of money for those days. And Capablanca won, of course. The final score was 9-5, at which point, when Capablanca was +4, Lasker simply resigned the match. So we joined this game after move 23 for black. So Capablanca is playing black. He just played rook to d5, and Lasker exchanges rooks. There's simply nothing better he can do. Now, after rook takes d5, of course, Capablanca does not take with the knight, even though his knight would be lovely and centralized. He does not take with the e-pawn, leaving himself with the backward c-pawn. He takes c takes d5. Now the rook is open. And now here are some of Capablanca's notes. In the analysis of the game. These notes are from 1921. If you would like to get a PGN with all the notes, and I've prepared them for all 4 games, you can find it in the Patreon feed. So Capablanca says, black has now the open file and his left side pawn position is very solid. Okay, that's true, while white has a weak d-pawn. The apparently weak black a-pawn is not actually weak because white has no way to attack it, and that's a great observation. In this position, Lasker continues queen to d2, and Capablanca plays knight f5, immediately targeting the weakness. And Lasker plays b3. Capablanca says, in order to free the queen from defense of the b-pawn and also to prevent rook c4 at any stage. So that's true. That's a very nice move, in fact. And now Capablanca plays something thematic for him. He wins on all sides of the board. And in an endgame, there are 2 things you can do, or 2 things you would like to do. One of them is actually an ability. It's the ability to calculate precisely until the end of the line. And that's crucial in many endgame positions. The other thing is winning on all sides of the board with generally sound ideas, which is going to make it easier for you to calculate the critical positions when they come. And Capablanca's next move is a great example of that. And he plays h5. And he writes, I played this in order to prevent g4 at a later stage, which is true, this would dislodge the knight. Also, to make a demonstration on the king's side, preparatory to further operations on the other side. So he blocks up the king's side a bit before continuing on the queen side. h3, and now he says weak, but white wants to be ready to play g4, and now h4. continuing his expansion on the king side and tying up white's king side, and it's clear that white will want to break open the position with g4 at some point, which once h5 has been played is going to induce even more weaknesses. Queen d3 by Lasker and rook to c6. Now this move may seem strange, but he's preparing to double with the rook in front. King f1. Lasker basically has no way to improve his position. I mean, even if the knight reaches the e5 square, then it could be just chased away with f6 if the situation allows it, if the king and rook are not forked, for example. But once the knight moves, the d4 pawn becomes incredibly weak and almost impossible to defend. So g6, another great move by Capablanca, simply defending this knight, simply giving his king some extra space, meaning that if a check happens, the queen won't be targeting the h7 square, and the king on g7 is perfectly safe. Queen to b1. And now it was possible to play queen c7, and after rook c1 the pawn would fall, so rook c1 would be impossible. So rook c2 is happening unless rook d2 is played. So that was possible. Instead, queen b4 played, putting more pressure on the pawn. And now Lasker plays king g1, and Capablanca says this was white's sealed move. It was not the best move, but it's doubtful if white has any good system of defense. And that's true. White can only wait. It's really hard to improve the position. Okay, and now Capablanca continues. Now coming back to the second principle of the endgame, of winning on all sides of the board, which Capablanca was perfect at. Try to come up with black's next move or plan. Okay, so he plays a5, and the idea is, firstly, a7 is a weakness. So for the moment, black has something to solve in his position. After he gets rid of a7, then he has no weaknesses, and the idea is to play a4, create an isolated pawn on b3, which can then become a second weakness in the position. Queen b2 played. Let me just say that a3 would not be good, because then the rook could switch to the attack over here, and once again a weakness. So queen b2 and a4. Now Capablanca says, now black exchanges the pawn and leaves white with a weak isolated b pawn, which will fall sooner or later. Queen d2. And now many of us would be, well, compelled to leave the queens on the board, because the queens are great at targeting weaknesses, but this position is actually pretty simple now, and queen takes d2, rook takes d2, ab3, and rook b6. And this move forces rook to d3. If rook to b2 is played, then rook b4 just wins one of the pawns. There's no way to defend both. So after rook b6, rook d3 has to be played, and this now prevents the rook from defending from b2, which this is an awkward place for the rook. Now basically the rook is defending both pawns, and Capablanca just switches, rook a6, g4 finally breaking open the position, h takes, f takes, and now more weaknesses, obviously. Rook a2, cutting the king off, attacking the knight, knight to c3 attacks the rook, and rook to c2. In this position rook b2 was possible, but after knight d1 the rook would have to move anyway, so rook c2 and knight d1. And Capablanca says the alternative knight a4 was not any better, white's game is doomed. That's true, white is lost here. After knight d1 he plays a great move, knight e7, realizing that the pressure on d4 is not enough to win this game. He just transfers his knight to, well, this square and targets the b3 pawn, which after the knight reaches a5 can no longer be protected. Knight e3 played, rook c1 check with tempo, king f2, knight c6, the knight is coming to a5. Knight d1 played in this position, and now in this position simply rook to b1. There's a nice idea of playing knight b4 instead of rook b1, but after rook to d2 and rook to b1, knight b2 is possible, and the endgame after the exchange is actually not winning, so rook takes b2, knight d3, king e3, knight b2 is a draw. But in this position he could simply continue with knight c6 and put pressure here, continue putting pressure here, and white's pieces are basically tied down, but rook b1 is better. Okay, and in this position there is no way to defend the pawn. Obviously knight a5 is coming, whatever white does, So Lasker gives up the pawn straight away with king to e2, and Capablanca says not a mistake, but played deliberately. White had no way to protect his b pawn. If, for example, h4 is played, trying not to be forked, then simply knight a5 and the pawn drops. But after king e2, of course, there's a tactic. You can take on b3, and after rook takes b3, you can play knight check and win the rook back with a completely winning endgame. So after rook takes b3, king e3 was played, stepping out of the fork, but now rook b4, and just continues pressuring those pawns. And the conversion is pretty clean. Knight c3, knight e7, the knight goes back to f5, knight e2, maybe it was possible to play g4, but that leaves other weaknesses. Knight f5 check, king f2, g5, g4, knight to d6, now looking at the e4 square, knight g1, knight e4 check, king f1, rook b1 check, and after king g2, he has to make sure that the king is cut off. Playing king f3 would be very risky and running into all sorts of issues. So king to f1, and now the king is cut off. So, excuse me, all sorts of issues. After king f3, that's checkmate. That would be checkmate. Wait, here and here. King f1 is safer. It's not checkmate, but it's very close to that. Maybe simply rook here wins. Okay, so king f1 is safer. Now rook f2 check, king e1 and rook a2. And here Capablanca says all these moves have a meaning. The student should carefully study them. Okay, so king f1, and basically Capablanca now improves his position, plays f6, then brings the king to the other side of the board, dislodges the king, rook e3 played, nothing threatened, and now the final break, which simply wins the position, e5, and after rook to d3, e d4, rook d4, king c5, the pawn is marching forward because the white king is cut off. Rook d1 played by Lasker, d4, rook c1 check, and king d5, and here Lasker resigned. Capablanca says there is nothing left. The black pawn will advance and white will have to give up his knight for it. This is the finest win of the match and probably took away from Dr. Lasker his last real hope of winning or drawing the match. And with this game, Capablanca became the world champion. So I thought this was astonishing. If you look at the original position, excuse me, here, after rook takes d5, c takes d5, it's winning, but it's not clear. But he knew exactly what to do, and he won on both sides of the board. He improved his position on both sides of the board, and then the weaknesses were just too many for white, and black had none. So a perfect conversion, a very clean game, and that's what Capablanca was known for, very clean conversions. Okay, moving on to the next game. This is a game he played in London in 1922 against Henry Atkins, who is a British player. And London 1922 was one of the greatest tournaments up to that point. It was absolutely astonishing. The lineup was absolutely astonishing. In this game, I'm going to share some notes by Giza Maroczy, the man who gave us the best pawn structure in chess, the Maroczy bind. So this tournament was won by Capablanca. He had 13 points in the tournament, no losses, only 4 draws. So an incredible result, 13 out of 15. Elekain came second with 11.5. Vidmar, Yugoslavia's first GM, came in third with 11. Then look at the lineup. So Capablanca, Alechin, Vidmar, Rubinstein, Bogolyubov, Reti, Tartakower, Maroczy, Yates, Atkins, Max Juve, and then a few random people. Znosko, Borovsky, have no idea who that is. Vachtluch, have no idea who that is either. Morrison, Watson, Marotti. So an incredible lineup, and Capablanca had 13 out of 15. Okay, we are starting in the position after move 37 for white. So again, we have a position with equal material. Both sides have 2 rooks, bishop, knight, and 6 pawns. Again, black has almost no weaknesses, and white has weaknesses. And the most important thing is black's piece activity. Now, how do you amplify that piece activity? Well, Capablanca first plays rook c4, which is an excellent move, simply giving his knight an entry point into the position without blocking in the rook pair. And rook c1, of course, played by Mr. Henry Atkins. And in this position, well, trading off the rooks wouldn't mean much, even though the rook on a2 is misplaced. Instead, Capablanca plays the excellent knight c6. And I wanted to show you this game because I think it's incredible that he gives up the advantage of controlling the open file with two rooks to get his knight into play. I think most people would think, my knight is on a7, but if I move it, then my rooks are blocked, and who knows what's going to happen. No, Capablanca just plays knight c6, the absolutely best move. If in this position rook a to a1 is played, this gives white better chances. White took the rook, but in this position knight e7, connecting the rooks, now rook c4, king d3 probably, maybe bishop to d6, centralizing the bishop, preparing knight c6, knight b4, and black is better, but this gives white better chances. The rook is dislodged. If the rook goes to b4, it could easily be tied down after b3. And dropping the rook back would allow black to almost equalize, white to almost equalize. So this would have been a better position for white, but still better than what happened in the game, but still easier for black to play. Instead, black exchanged, thinking that, well, blocking the c file could give him something. Also, maybe once this pawn moves, the bishop gets activity and attacks b6. dc4, knight d2, and now simply bishop takes d2. And that's the refutation of the move. King takes d2 and king d6. Not knight b4 straight away. You want to centralize your king. And you can see that Capablanca played such principled moves. Once the king gets to d5, he's going to have a much better king than white. If you've ever seen a Ben Feingold video, then you know that centralizing your king is the most important thing in the endgame. So, king c3 played, good move, king d5, and rook a1, finally getting the rook into play. And now, well, I think the automatic move for most people would be knight b4. It's not a bad move, but there are ways to improve the position. First, he plays g6, making sure there are absolutely no targets. Also, making sure that if this pawn moves, the knight has an outpost on f5, nevertheless. f3 played, which I don't like because it gives up the g3 square, which may or may not be important, but okay, it gives the bishop some more scope. And anyway, it's hard to find a move for white. And now how do you continue here? All of your pieces are optimal. If you play knight b4, what's the follow-up? I mean, knight d6, fine, but what then? It could be undermined with b3. So actually, knight b4, knight d6 is unclear. You could try playing for e5, but then pawn takes, knight takes, bishop b6, rook b8, I don't know. It seems bishop a5, rook b3 check, king c2, you're not getting enough. So he plays the probably best and easiest way to improve the position, rook to b8. And this is very simple, he just wants to play b5. Now, he's trading weaknesses. He is going to have a weakness on a5, white is going to have a weakness on b2, and he understands that that's better for black. So rook a3 played, which I don't quite understand, but okay. And b5. This has to be taken, otherwise b4. So ab, rook b. Bishop f2 played, transferring the bishop, and now finally knight b4. Now that this pawn has been weakened, it's been targeted by the rook. Now he can put pressure on that pawn, and now it's all over after this exchange with ab5, rook b5. b3 played, which is a good plan and a good move, trying to get rid of this pawn. Trying to get rid of this pawn, and also not allow the knight into d6. That has to be taken. So c takes, and king takes. And in this position, there was a really nice move and a nice way to get a completely winning position, which Capablanca had missed. But what he did was strong nonetheless. So, pause the video, find a good plan here. Okay, Capablanca played knight c6, which is good. Knight d3 is crushing. So king a4 attacks the rook. And now rook to b2, attacking the bishop. There's basically nothing better but to trade bishop for knight. If you take on a5, then I take the bishop, take on b2. If you take the knight, I take the bishop anyway. So there's nothing better but to do that. If you move the bishop, then my knight gets into play, and well, you will lose. So I was looking at rook d3, rook f2, and g4 saving the pawn. Now simply rook a2 check, and after king b5, you play g5, and this is a completely winning rook endgame. Why is it completely winning? Well, I'm going to play rook h2 at some point. If you move the rook, I'm going to play king takes d4. Your king has no way into the position. The king only has two squares, b6 and a6, and you don't want your king on either one of those squares. So white is pretty much in Zugzwang. He can only move the rook from d1 to d3. Otherwise, his position collapses. And even if he does that, his position collapses. Instead, Capablanca played knight c6 check. And now the king went to c3. Rook to b1, trying to get behind. And rook a4, which, well, defends this pawn. I mean, it's a passive position. Rook c1 check played, and here's the critical mistake after which the game is just easy to win. Mr. Atkins should have played king to d2, king to d3 to defend the c4 square, and making rook c4 impossible. After this, probably knight b4 check, something like king to e3, rook c3 check, and black is still better, no doubt about that, but white is surviving for 10 or 20 more moves. After king d2 though, rook c4 is just game over, and the rook now has to move. This pawn can drop, but you don't want to get into a drawn rook and pawn endgame, so Capablanca just plays the sadistic a4, and this I think is a great move. Rook a3 played, he just waits. There's nothing in this position, nothing better in this position. Again, you don't really want to trade here, you don't want to take. It's just not as good. Instead, knight a7 played. And why is this so instructive? Well, one of the reasons why I chose this game is that Capablanca did not take the d4 pawn. What the consequence of not taking the d4 pawn is that this bishop has absolutely no scope, and this king is safe. There are no checks along the d file, and simply transferring the knight to b5 is going to make this pawn run away. You can see that the king is cut off from the queen side, and that the bishop is cut off from the queen side. So rook a1 played, knight b5, not knight b4, excuse me. Rook b1 played, attacks the knight, but now simply king c6, and this check does nothing. So king d3, rook c3 check, everything comes with tempo, king to d2, whoa, excuse me, king to d2, and now simply rook to b3, and this he can resign. If rook c1, you don't want to go to d5 because of rook c5 and some activity, but king to b7, very clean. Rook c2 played, a3, the pawn marches on. Bishop g3, the bishop finally gets some activity, but this diagonal is empty, no future here or here. Because of this pawn. If this pawn weren't on the board, then it would have been easier. And now Capablanca finally decides to take it, so knight takes d4. And Atkins gets rook c7 check, but after king b6, rook c4, attacking the knight, king b5, just, well, leaves the knight. If you take the knight, then a2, a1, queens. Rook c8 played, getting behind the pawn, but knight c6, and of course the idea is to be able to cover on a5 if the rook goes to a8. So rook a8, first he throws in rook to b2 check, and after king to d3, he takes on g2, he doesn't even bother with knight a5, bishop f2 played, and now finally knight to b4. This is prettier than knight a5, because if the pawn is taken, you can just fork. And in this position, Atkins resigned, obviously 2 pawns down, and black is going to make a queen. I'm astonished by how good his technique was. I think he would be able to fight the strongest grandmasters today in a simplified position. He was just extremely precise. Now, the next two games are his most famous. The next two games are probably the two most famous games Capablanca had ever played, and they're absolutely astonishing. The first one is Capablanca Tartakower from New York 1924. Let me give you a brief intro. In this game I'm going to be sharing some notes by Alechin and by Reti, who'd played this tournament. So, in December of 1923, following an aborted attempt to arrange a world championship match between Capablanca and Alechin, Herman Helms, publisher of the American Chess Bulletin, Harry Letts, the general manager of the Hotel Alamaki, New York, and Norbert Lederer, the secretary of the Manhattan Chess Club, set about organizing a tournament to rival Cambridge Springs, which was one of the most famous tournaments. The tournament took place in the Hotel Alamac from the 16th of March to the 18th of April 1924. This became the most famous tournament at the time. And the next game from New York 1927 is actually a follow-up of that tournament, which the 1927 tournament was organized because this one was so successful. Now, the scores. First, the lineup. Lasker, Capablanca, Alechin, Marshall, Reti, Maroczy, Bogolyubov, Tartakower, Yates, Edward Lasker, and Janowski, the best players in the world. Lasker won this tournament with 16 points, only one loss. Capablanca came in second with one loss and few more draws than Lasker with 14 and a half. Alechin was third, Marshall was fourth, Reti was fifth, etc. So Capablanca came in second. This is probably, well, I'm not sure which one of the next two games is his most famous, this one or the next one. I'm going to say the next one, but I like this one more. Okay, if you don't know it, then just I'm very happy that you don't know it. Fine. White's turn to move. Both sides have 6 pawns. It's rook and bishop versus rook and knight. White has 3-2 on the king side. Black has a 4-3 on the queen side, which is pretty mobile compared to White's pawn majority. But White for the moment has a problem that this pawn is very hard it's very hard to push this pawn because f4 would then be weak. So Capablanca comes up with an incredible concept, which today is, of course, well known. It was known back then. It's not something like, okay, it's just a great way to blast open the position and to give your pieces a lot more scope. He plays the move h5, and in this position, Alechin says, the calamity, the rook, this is the calamity. The rook now enters the hostile camp. And of course, well, this pawn is under attack. You can defend it with rook g7, or you can defend it with rook f6, or you can take. If you take, then rook h1 wins the pawn back because you don't have rook f5. So rook f6 played. hg, hg, and rook h1. Now Richard Reti says, White plays logically to utilize his advantage on the king side and very properly does not concern himself with the weaknesses of the queen side. Black, on the other hand, makes a defensive move which he could have perhaps omitted. And Reti plays king f8. This is the best move. It's just very natural to bring your king closer. Okay, Capablanca of course continues rook h7. And in this position, if rook f7 is played, then of course bishop takes g6 with a completely winning position. So he plays rook c6. This was the defense he'd planned all along, targeting this weakness and of course defending both of his pawns. Now, Reti says, anxious nature might have moved the king towards the queen side, but Capablanca adheres to the principle of aggression that governs rook endings and plays g4. King h3 is the natural move, which seems good. After king h3, something like knight c4 and king g4 and knight d2. If you play king g5, then you could run into trouble after knight e4 check. So this is the move you would like to play, but knight e4 check. Now if you take this, d takes, this pawn is loose, this pawn is free to roam. It's complicated. Capablanca doesn't want complicated. So he plays g4, which is extremely understandable. Of course, if you take here, then I take here, and it's not good. Okay, knight c4 played. And in this position, Capablanca actually gives up a pawn, which Tartakower does not take. He could have won a pawn. he did not want to. Capablanca plays g5, which is an incredible move. Firstly, this gives you the option to create a passed pawn. Secondly, more importantly, fixes the weakness on g6. Thirdly, gives your rook some squares. It's just an incredible move. Also makes it impossible for rook f6 to be played again. So how could black had won a pawn? Well, he could have played knight e3 check, and after king f3 he could have played knight d1. After knight d1, for example, king e2, knight takes pawn, king to d2, knight e4 check. You can take this, d takes, king e3, and white is undoubtedly better. For example, rook c4, and you can take on e4 and c5, and now simply rook takes a7. White should win this position. Capablanca was correct in his assessment, so black did not go for that. Instead, after g5, knight b2 was played, which is an inferior move. And oh, excuse me, knight b2 should have been played. Just give me a second. What was played is knight e3, as I suggested to win the pawn, but after knight f3, after king f3, Tartakower simply played knight f5, just losing the position. What he should have played instead of knight e3 check is knight to b2, which is a very interesting way to play this position. And after something like bishop to c2, well, this pawn is dropping. It's complicated. You can trade weaknesses, and basically these two pawns are going to be stronger, but it's better than what happened in the game. Okay, knight e3 played, king f3, and now the way to save this position, or try to save this position, was knight d1, nevertheless, and maybe not go for this pawn, but try to complicate things, maybe take it with the rook. Okay, but knight f5 played, and now bishop f5, gf5. And Tartakower's idea is clear. After this trade, he's going to win the c3 pawn, and then maybe get enough counterplay on the queen side. And this next move is maybe Capablanca's most famous endgame move. So what he does here is just astonishing. I've seen this analyzed multiple times, and I'm sorry if my analysis sort of takes away some beauty from this position. He plays king to g3, and this was quite rare at the time, completely ignoring material. Atkins says, decisive, exclaim. White sacrifices material in order to obtain the classical position with king on f6, pawn on g6, and rook on h7, whereupon the black pawns stumble like ripe apples. Okay, rook c3, king h4, rook f3, fine, grab some more material. g6, rook takes f4 check, king to g5, rook e4, and of course taking another pawn would be quite risky. And now this is the second like astonishing idea. So not taking the pawn, but king f6. And Richard Reti says it's a frequently available finesse in such positions, not to capture hostile pawns, but to pass them by in order to be protected in the rear against checks by the rook. Okay, king to g8, rook g7, king to h8 played, and rook takes c7, and everything is collapsing. Rook e8 played, of course, this is threatening mate, so you have to prevent that, so rook e8. And now simply king takes f5, and it's game over. You could also play king f7 with the threat of check, but rook g8 could complicate things. So king takes f5, very simple. Still, like, it's impossible to defend for black. Rook e4 played, king f6 again threatening mate. Now it's possible to check on f4, but king e5, and it's just rook g4, g7 check. If you trade rooks, game over. And king g8, rook takes a7, king g1, king takes d5, rook c1, king to d6, rook c2, d5, the pawn is just marching forward. And after rook c7, rook a1, king c6, rook a4, and d6, this is game over. In this position, finally Tartakower resigned. It's way too late. that the resignation came. And Reti says, Capablanca's management of the endgame gives the impression of being so natural that one easily forgets the difficulty of such precise play. The difficulty is chiefly psychological. In chess, as in life, one is so accustomed to place value on the material factors that it's not easy to conceive the idea of indulging in pawn sacrifices when there is so little available material. And that's true. People tend to look for sacrifices rarely when there are only a few pawns on the board. An astonishing game. As I said, he did not win this tournament. He came in second behind Lasker. Now, finally, I'm going to say the greatest Capablanca endgame of all time. This I've talked about in one of my videos already, but I can never get enough of this game. So this is Nimzowitsch Capablanca, New York, 1927. Let me give you a brief intro about the tournament. So, following the success of the tournament in 1924, Norbert Lederer and his associates decided to hold a match tournament of 6 or 7 masters where each player would meet the other competitors 4 times. Maroczy was asked to be the tournament director, and invitations were sent to Capablanca, Lasker, Marshall, Alechin, Bogolyubov, Nimzowitsch and Vidmar. Capablanca was the only player who would get an appearance fee, world champion. However, due to an incident in one of his games with Capablanca in 1924, Lasker was involved in a bitter and public dispute with Capablanca and some members of the organizing committee. I'm not sure which games they are referring to. He didn't reply to his invitation, and his place was offered to Spielmann. Spielmann immediately accepted the invitation. Bogolyubov then wrote back asking for an appearance fee of $1,500 and that the tournament should be replaced by a world championship match between himself and Capablanca. So Bogolyubov is that's just weird. His conditions were given in the form of an ultimatum, which the committee couldn't accept, of course, and they also decided that his place wouldn't be offered to anyone else, so the number of players was now reduced. So basically, after the drama between Lasker and Capablanca, Bogolyubov came up and gave some demands, and they said no, and by the way, you're not playing in the tournament, so great. Anyway, Capablanca won the tournament with no losses. Alechin came in second, Nimzowitsch third, Vidmar fourth, Spielmann fifth, and Marshall came in sixth with only 1 win, I believe, and 5 or 6 losses. Okay, now we reach this position and move 27. Again, it's 7 pawns each, 2 rooks, knight, queen each, and black is better. Why is black better? Well, black has something he can target. Black has squares he could jump into, and black has an easy plan of infiltration. Now, infiltrating black's position, on the other hand, is almost impossible. There's just no way for white to maneuver his pieces in a way that would increase their scope and allow them into black's position. The move you would like to make is b3 at some point, which would, well, prevent what black is about to do, but then you create a weakness on c3 and a weakness on a3, and these are just too much. Okay, so what Capablanca does is astonishing. I hope you didn't see the game before. So firstly, rook c4, exclaim. Now why is this move so strong? Firstly, b3, as we said, would weaken the position too much. Secondly, once this knight is gone, then your rook could come into e4. And this is the key idea. As soon as the rook comes into e4, the king is unsafe, the queen is harassed, the f4 pawn is attacked, and the other rook could come into c4. So this plan is very simple once you know it. Queen h3 played, fine. King g7, slightly improving his position, okay. Rook f2 played, white basically waits. And now a5, a great move, blocking in the queen side if possible. If he can play a4, then that's good. Rook e2 again, waiting. And by the way, if b3 preventing a4, then simply rook c7 and everything is loose. And obviously, black will have an easy time targeting those. So a5 and rook e2. And in this position, you can play knight c6. That's equally good. Because after b3, you can take the knight, take the rook, so you're not losing tactically. Capablanca plays knight f5, which leads to the same end. If the knight is not exchanged off straight away, then black can take. And obviously this pawn is going to end up on d5, which is going to mean that rook c2 is possible. So let's play a random move. I don't know, here. Then, okay, now the pawn is dropping. Let's defend. Okay, so here and here and here. Now if you take with the rook, I take on b2 and win. If you take with the pawn, I just keep targeting your stuff, and I can blockade with a4. Then I can simply try to bring my rook here and bring my queen here, or I can advance the pawn, create an isolated pawn on b2, or I can simply play rook c4 and put tremendous pressure on this one. So it's just, that would be unholdable. So after knight f5, Nimzowitsch trades off and g takes f5, which is a great move. If why g takes h5? Well, this is something we have to discuss. If firstly, if he takes f5, then rook d5 would be more than equal for white. White would actually be in a great position. After g takes f5, you may be wondering, well, what happens after queen h5? Well, after queen h5, rook h8 gives black a winning position. Queen f3 defending f4, and simply rook h4. And this pawn is dropping, and with it the queen is harassed. h2 is dropping, and okay, so queen f3 defending f4 instead of taking on h5, and now king g6 blockading, making sure this pawn can never move, making sure this pawn can never be taken. Rook e to d2, and Nimzowitsch has nothing, he just waits. And now the second part of the plan, simple, rook e4. Next move, rook c4. The only way to prevent that is rook to d4, but rook c4 anyway. Whichever rook you take, my rook is still going to be on e4, and there's nothing you can do. Queen f2 preparing some tricks with the queen, maybe, but just queen b5 unpinning. King g3, he waits. If rook takes e4, then of course rook takes e4, and let's say h4 to blockade, then queen c4, and this pawn is too weak. White's pieces are coming in. It's just unholdable. You can play a4, blockade this one, and eventually something is going to drop. So king g3 played, rook takes rook, pawn takes. If rook takes, then of course you can take, and if queen takes here. If pawn takes, then a4, and this is going to be very hard to defend with so many weaknesses in the position. The queen is a great piece to target weaknesses. So rook takes and c takes, keeping the rook on the board, although judging by what happened in the game later on, maybe taking with the rook was better. Queen c4, getting into the position. Of course, if rook to c2, then queen takes d4. So king g2 played, and now b5, blocking everything. King g1, Nimzowitsch waits. And now not a4, because it's hard to attack the weakness when the b file is closed, but b4, and just amplifying the weakness on b2. Takes, a takes, Nimzowitsch waits again. And now queen c1. The infiltration begins. And now the position is already lost. Not only because white has 4 weaknesses, h2, f4, d4, and b2, but because the king is in tremendous trouble. King g3 played, and now queen h1. And look at these pieces coming in. This is just wonderful stuff. I love this. So rook d3 was played in the game. Let's look at the alternative, queen to g2. Now, against queen to g2, there's a very simple way to win. You can play h4. Now, if king h3, declining the pawn, then queen takes g2, and king takes g2, and rook takes f4, and everything is collapsing. King takes g5 next. If after h4, king takes h4, then you play queen e1 check, and of course queen g3 is impossible because of queen d2, and after rook f2, you just play rook e2. And this is game over. King g3, you have to defend, and now rook takes b2, and this pawn is going to queen. So defending with the queen was impossible. Instead, rook to d3 played. Okay, now another great move, rook e1. And the threats now are, it's basically impossible to defend against all of them. Well, the threats include rook f1 and rook g1 trying to mate. They also include rook e2 in some positions, winning the queen. They also include rook back to e4, winning stuff. They also include rook to e3 if you move the queen or rook away. In this position, let's look at one move that wasn't played, queen f3, simply trying to exchange queens. Well, now you can play queen g1 check, and after king h3, you can play queen g4, and easily winning. There are other ways to win. This is just the most human way to win that I would play myself. The queen has to be taken, because otherwise it's, well, no other legal moves. So queen takes g4, f takes g4, leaving this option of creating a passed pawn, and after, for example, king to g3, then simply rook e4, and you are going to play king f5 next and win. If rook b3, which may seem interesting, then rook d4, and again, king f5 next, game over. So queen f3 doesn't help. Rook f3 was played, and now a very funny Zugzwang position appears on the board. Rook d1, b3 played. There are no other moves for white. I'm going to show you why. Here black waits one more time. Okay, this is basically Zugzwang, and there are no better options for white but to wait. But however you wait, you lose. Rook e3 was played in the game. Let's look at some other options after rook c1. If you play king h3, waiting with the king, then rook c2, and this is immediately over. If you move the queen, you get mated. If you take, then you get mated. So that's it. If after rook c1 you play king h4, same thing. Rook c2, same thing. You can now play queen g3, but then they take here. If you play rook to d3, that's pretty similar to the game. You can play rook to c3, or you can play rook to f1, attacking the queen, and this is immediately crushing. If you play rook c3, for example, which wasn't played in the game after rook e3, but it's still interesting. If this pawn is if this rook is taken, then b takes, for example, queen e2, then queen e4, and this forces either this pawn forward or everything drops. One more thing that could have been tried is, let's say, waiting with the queen with queen e2. Now again, rook c3. This is immediately crushing. Let's say h3, waiting, and you can just improve your position with king g7, or you can play, I don't know, you can just wait. He's basically in Zugzwang. The rook is immobile. If you take, then black wins. For example, rook d3, trying to wait with the rook. Now you can play queen e4, and whatever is moved, white collapses. In the game, rook to e3 was played, and here again you can play rook c3. This is winning. Let's say king h3, and now you can play queen e4, which is a remarkable idea because the rook is pinned, and basically the rook drops. There's nothing better but taking this rook, and now again this pawn will queen. So that was winning. Instead of that, after rook e3, rook f1 was played, and here, who wrote notes on this one? I forgot. But the note is, one might suppose that this game that Capablanca had carefully read my system and then used all the theories contained therein against their inventor. Of course, Nimzowitsch being the writer of my system, one of the most famous chess books of all time. So rook f1, the threat is simply to take the queen, and there is no defense. If you move the queen away, for example, queen e2, then queen g1 check, and after king h3, rook f2. Again, you either get mated or lose the queen. After rook f1, the game was over. If you try queen g1, then rook g1, and again you lose the queen. So absolutely astonishing what he did to Aron Nimzowitsch. I hope you liked the 4 games. I tried to give you 4 different Capablanca endgames, tried to give you my favorites. If there are more games you would like me to cover, I plan to be doing part 2 of Capablanca's endgames, so let me know which are your favorites. Again, the PGN is available on the Patreon feed with all the notes and all the analysis. And thank you. Again, any feedback is appreciated, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.